Have you ever had that moment when the person who doubted you most was forced to see your true value? That gut-wrenching second when someone who dismissed your dreams suddenly realizes you've surpassed them? Today's story is about Emma, whose father's cutting words at a family dinner were, "You've always been the disappointment." But everything changed when his boss walked in and called her ma'am. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Wright grew up in the shadow of her father's expectations. In Lakeside, a town best known for its prestigious medical community. Her father, Dr. Richard Wright, was the highly respected chief of surgery at Lakeside Memorial, a position he'd held for nearly 2 decades. In their household, medicine wasn't just a profession, it was the family legacy. Emma's grandfather had been a surgeon, her father was a surgeon, and her older sister Olivia was following the same path, already completing her residency at Johns Hopkins. Emma was the outlier. From childhood, she had been drawn to business and finance, fascinated by markets and investment strategies, while her family discussed surgical techniques over dinner. She'd spend hours creating mock portfolios, tracking stocks, and reading about successful entrepreneurs while her father and sister pored over medical journals. "It's just a phase," her father would say dismissively whenever Emma talked about business school. The Wright family produces doctors, not accountants. Despite his disapproval, Emma pursued her passion. She graduated with honors from Wharton Business School and landed a position at Meridian Capital, a prestigious investment firm. While her accomplishments would have made most parents burst with pride, Dr. Wright regarded her career as if she'd settled for mediocrity. During her first years at Meridian, Emma worked tirelessly, putting in 80-hour weeks and sacrificing her personal life to climb the corporate ladder. She developed a reputation for having an almost uncanny ability to identify undervalued healthcare companies with breakthrough potential. Her specialty became medical technology investments, a small nod to her family's field that went unappreciated by her father. Every time she visited home, the conversation inevitably turned to Olivia's achievements. "Your sister just published her research in the New England Journal of Medicine," her father would announce, not bothering to ask about Emma's work. When Emma mentioned closing a major deal or receiving a promotion, he would nod vaguely before changing the subject. Her mother, Catherine, tried to bridge the gap but rarely challenged her husband directly. "He just wants what's best for you," she would whisper when they were alone. "Medicine is all he knows." But Emma saw the truth. In her father's eyes, she had chosen the wrong path, and no success in her field could compensate for not becoming a doctor. Last December, Emma received life-changing news. After orchestrating a series of highly successful healthcare technology investments, she was promoted to senior vice president at Meridian Capital, overseeing their entire healthcare portfolio. At 32, she was the youngest person to hold this position in the firm's history. The promotion came with another responsibility: leading Meridian's new Healthcare Innovation Fund, a $500 million initiative to invest in medical facilities and technologies nationwide. Emma would have the final say on which hospitals and research centers received funding for expansion and modernization. When her mother called to invite her home for her father's birthday dinner, Emma decided this achievement was significant, enough that perhaps, finally, she might earn her father's respect. She packed her best outfit and practiced how she would share her news. The dinner started pleasantly enough. Olivia talked about her fellowship. Her mother served her famous roast beef, and her father seemed in unusually good spirits. Emma waited for a natural opening in the conversation. "I actually have some news to share," she said during a lull between main course and dessert. "I've been promoted to senior vice president at Meridian." Her mother beamed. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. Isn't that wonderful, Richard?" Her father nodded slightly. "Congratulations. I'm sure it's an important position in your world," Emma pressed on. I'll be overseeing a new $500 million healthcare fund. We're investing in medical facilities across the country, helping hospitals modernize and expand their research capabilities. Something flickered across her father's face. Interest, perhaps, but it vanished quickly. Well, I suppose that's adjacent to real medicine, at least. Olivia, attempting to be supportive, asked, "That sounds impressive, Em. How many people are you managing now?" "A team of 30 directly, but the investments affect thousands of healthcare professionals." Her father scoffed, swirling his whiskey. "Moving money around isn't the same as saving lives, Emma. I performed 3 surgeries today, 3 families who still have their loved ones because of real work, not paperwork." The familiar sting of his dismissal felt sharper this time, coming on the heels of her greatest professional achievement. "Richard," her mother warned quietly. "What?" "I'm simply stating facts. Olivia is publishing groundbreaking research while working 80-hour weeks saving actual human beings. Emma sits in an office making rich people richer." Emma set down her fork. "That's not what I do, Dad. My investments help hospitals get the equipment they need. They fund research that creates the tools Olivia uses." Her father leaned forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd used since she was a child. "Let's be honest, Emma. You chose the easy path. You've always taken the easy path. That's why you'll always be the disappointment in this family." The table fell silent. Her mother gasped. Even Olivia looked uncomfortable. "Richard," her mother finally managed. But Emma was already standing, napkin placed carefully beside her half-eaten dessert. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. I think I should go." "Emma, please," her mother started. But Emma had already turned away, fighting back tears that she refused to let fall in front of her father. As she gathered her coat from the hall closet, her phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Marcus Thompson, her assistant at Meridian. She almost ignored it, but decided professional distraction was exactly what she needed. "Marcus, what's up?" "I'm sorry to bother you on your family weekend, but we just received the final documentation on the Lakeside Memorial proposal. The board wants your approval before proceeding with the site visit next week." Emma froze. "Lakeside Memorial? Here in Lakeside?" "Yes. They're requesting $42 million for their cardiothoracic wing expansion and new surgical training facility. The preliminary numbers look good, but you'll need to sign off on the final evaluation team." A strange calm settled over Emma as pieces clicked into place. Lakeside Memorial, her father's hospital, was seeking funding from her fund. They needed her approval. "Send me the files tonight. I'll review everything before the site visit," she said, her voice steady. "So you're still planning to lead the site visit personally?" Marcus asked. Emma hadn't been planning to, but now, "Absolutely. Schedule it for Wednesday. I'm already in town." As she ended the call, Emma noticed her father standing in the hallway watching her. "Work emergency?" he asked, his tone suggesting that whatever it was couldn't possibly compare to a medical emergency. "Something like that," Emma replied. "A hospital seeking investment from my fund." He nodded absently. "Well, don't let us keep you from your spreadsheets." Emma smiled thinly. "Good night, Dad." That night in her hotel room, Emma pored over the Lakeside Memorial proposal. The hospital was seeking funds for a state-of-the-art cardiothoracic wing and surgical training center, with her father listed as the chief medical advisor on the project. The proposal was solid. The hospital had an excellent reputation, strong financials, and the expansion made strategic sense. Under normal circumstances, Emma would have approved it without hesitation. But now, she found herself torn. Part of her, a small, wounded part she wasn't proud of, wanted to reject the proposal, to show her father exactly how much power she wielded in her paper-pushing role. But as dawn broke, Emma made her decision. She would evaluate the proposal, with the same rigorous professionalism she applied to every investment. No favoritism, but no spite either. The hospital deserved that, even if her father didn't. She spent the next 2 days preparing, reviewing comparable investments, studying Lakeside Memorial's financials, and outlining questions for the site visit. She did not call her parents or tell them she would be visiting the hospital officially. Let him be surprised, she thought. Wednesday arrived, and Emma dressed with particular care, a tailored navy suit, subtle makeup, hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Professional, powerful, unassailable. She arrived at Lakeside Memorial with her team precisely at 9 a.m., the hospital. Administrator Ms. Jenkins greeted them in the lobby. "Ms. Wright, thank you so much for considering our proposal. We're honored to have the Senior Vice President herself conducting our site visit." "I have a personal interest in Lakeside," Emma replied neutrally. "Shall we begin?" The morning proceeded smoothly. Emma and her team toured existing facilities, reviewed plans for the expansion, and met with department heads. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ms. Jenkins seemed increasingly impressed with Emma's detailed knowledge of hospital operations and medical technology. "You have a remarkable understanding of healthcare administration for someone from the financial sector," she commented during a break. Emma smiled. "I grew up in a medical family. Some things you absorb through osmosis." After lunch, they were scheduled to meet with the chief medical advisor, her father. Emma had been anticipating this moment since she accepted the site visit, but now that it was imminent, her heart pounded. The conference room was already occupied when they entered. Several doctors sat around the table, and at its head, Dr. Richard Wright was in animated conversation with a colleague. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from professional interest to shock as he recognized his daughter. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Ms. Jenkins said. "May I introduce Ms. Emma Wright, Senior Vice President of Meridian Capital and head of their Healthcare Innovation Fund. Ms. Wright and her team will be making the final decision on our funding application." Her father stood frozen, mouth slightly open. The other doctors rose, extending hands and offering greetings, but Dr. Wright remained stunned. Emma stepped forward, extending her hand professionally. "Dr. Wright, a pleasure to meet you formally. I've reviewed your contribution to the proposal extensively." He took her hand automatically, still staring. "Emma, what are you doing here?" Ms. Jenkins looked confused. "Do you two know each other?" Emma smiled coolly. "Dr. Wright is my father, actually. But please, don't let that influence your presentations. I assure you all proposals are evaluated on their merits alone." A murmur went through the room. Her father's colleagues looked between them with new interest. "Well," Ms. Jenkins recovered quickly, "that's unexpected. But wonderful. Dr. Wright, your daughter is considering a substantial investment in our hospital. You must be very proud." All eyes turned to her father, who seemed to be processing this information in slow motion. Yes, of course." The hospital CEO, Mr. Blackwell, chose that moment to enter the room. "Sorry I'm late, everyone. Traffic was—" He stopped when he saw Emma. "Ms. Wright, I didn't realize you'd be here personally. What an honor." He crossed the room swiftly, hand extended. "We're so grateful you're considering our proposal. Dr. Wright has been instrumental in designing the new surgical center." "So I've read," Emma replied, shaking his hand. "His expertise is evident in the plans." Mr. Blackwell turned to her father. "Richard, you didn't mention your daughter was the Emma Wright from Meridian, the woman who revolutionized healthcare. Investment on the East Coast?" Her father cleared his throat. "I wasn't aware of the extent of Emma's position." "Not aware?" Mr. Blackwell looked genuinely surprised. "Your daughter is something of a legend in healthcare finance. The Northwestern University Medical Center expansion she funded last year has transformed trauma care in Chicago." Emma watched as her father struggled to reconcile the daughter he had dismissed with the professional being described. The meeting proceeded, with her father presenting the medical aspects of the proposal. He was a talented doctor and a compelling speaker, but Emma could see he was off balance, occasionally glancing at her as if seeing her for the first time. After the presentation, Emma and her team asked detailed technical questions that demonstrated her thorough understanding of both the financial and medical aspects of the proposal. With each insightful question, her father's expression shifted subtly from confusion to something that might have been respect. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Blackwell looked at Emma expectantly. "Do you have a sense of when we might hear your decision, Ms. Wright? My team will compile our findings and you should have our answer within 2 weeks," Emma replied professionally. "The proposal is strong, but we have several competing applications to consider." As the group dispersed, Mr. Blackwell pulled her father aside, not quite quietly enough. "Richard, why didn't you tell us about your daughter's influence? We could have been leveraging that connection all along." Her father's reply was too low to hear. Emma was gathering her documents when she felt a presence beside her. She looked up to find her father standing there, his expression unreadable. "I didn't know," he said simply. "You never asked," she replied. He nodded slowly. "The expansion. It's important to us. To me." Was he asking for favoritism? After years of dismissing her career? Every hospital that applies thinks their project is important, Dad. That's why we evaluate each one carefully. He seemed about to say more when Ms. Jenkins approached. "Dr. Wright, the board members have arrived for their tour. Ms. Wright, would you like to join us?" "Yes, ma'am," her father replied automatically, then caught himself. Yes, I'll be right there." Ms. Jenkins turned to Emma. "And you, Ms. Wright?" Emma smiled. "I've seen what I needed to see today. My team will be in touch with any follow-up questions." As Ms. Jenkins walked away, her father lingered. "Emma, about what I said at dinner." "We should discuss that another time," she interrupted gently. "This is a professional setting." He nodded, understanding. "Will you be at home tonight? Your mother would want to hear about this." "Development." Emma considered for a moment. "Yes, I'll be there at 7. The drive to her childhood home that evening felt different. Emma's knuckles weren't white on the steering wheel as they usually were before family dinners. Her stomach wasn't knotted with anticipation of her father's dismissals. For once, she was calm, centered in a newfound equilibrium that came from being seen, truly seen, for what she had accomplished. The modest brick colonial looked the same. As always, her mother's carefully tended hydrangeas lining the walkway. Emma parked beside Olivia's car and took a deep breath before retrieving the portfolio she'd brought. A detailed breakdown of how the hospital's proposal compared to others they'd funded, complete with her initial recommendations. She wasn't seeking her father's approval anymore, but she did want him to understand exactly what she did and why it mattered. Her mother opened the door before she could knock, enveloping her in a tight hug. "Emma, Richard told me what happened at the hospital today. Why didn't you say anything?" "I wanted to be professional," Emma replied simply. She followed her mother inside to find Olivia and her father already seated in the living room, both looking up as she entered. Olivia broke the awkward silence first. "So, my little sister holds the purse strings to Dad's dream project. That's quite the plot twist." Emma smiled at her sister. Despite following their father's path, Olivia had never shared his dismissiveness of Emma's career. "Just doing my job." Her father stood, his usual commanding presence somehow diminished. "Emma, I think we need to talk." "I brought some materials that might help you understand what my team is looking for," Emma replied, settling into an armchair and opening her portfolio. She was determined to keep this professional, not personal. "The hospital's proposal is strong, but there are areas where it could be more competitive." Her father shook his head. I don't want to talk about the proposal. Right now. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. I want to talk about what I said at dinner. About you being a disappointment. Emma stilled. This was unexpected. Her father rarely acknowledged his harsher moments, let alone addressed them directly. Richard has been beside himself all afternoon, her mother interjected, bringing in a tray of coffee. He couldn't stop talking about how impressed everyone at the hospital was with you. Emma looked at her father, waiting. I was wrong, he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. I've been wrong about your career, about what you've accomplished. Today, watching you in that meeting, hearing how Blackwell and the others spoke about your work, I realized I've never really understood what you do. No, you haven't, Emma agreed quietly. The hospital administrator called you a visionary, he continued. Said your funding model for the Chicago Trauma Center has become a case study at Harvard Business School. He shook his head slightly. All this time, I thought you were just playing with money. That's because you never bothered to ask what I actually do, Emma said, not unkindly but firmly. You decided my work wasn't valuable because it wasn't medicine, and you never reconsidered that judgment. Her father sat heavily on the sofa. You're right. I couldn't see past my own perspective. He looked up at her. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, or to give special consideration to our proposal, but I want you to know that I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Emma had imagined this moment, her father acknowledging he'd been wrong about her, countless times over the years. In her imagination, it had felt triumphant, vindicating. In reality, it felt more complicated. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a strange hollowness. The approval she had craved for so long now seemed less important than it once had. I appreciate that, Dad, she said finally. And I want you to know that your hospital's proposal will be evaluated fairly, on its merits. My personal feelings won't factor into the decision. Her father nodded. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. Olivia leaned forward. So what? Happens now with the proposal? Is Dad going to have to call you ma'am at future meetings? This broke the tension, and Emma found herself laughing alongside her family for what felt like the first time in years. The evening unfolded with surprising ease. Her father asked genuine questions about her work, how she evaluated proposals, what trends she was seeing in healthcare investment, what challenges she faced. Emma found herself explaining complex financial concepts, and he listened with the same focused attention he gave to medical lectures. At one point, he admitted, the financial side of hospital administration always frustrated me. I just want to do the medicine and let someone else worry about how to pay for it. That's exactly why people like me exist, Emma replied. So people like you can focus on saving lives without worrying about capital expenditures and ROI. A symbiotic relationship, her father mused. I never quite thought of it that way. As the evening drew to a close, her father walked her to her car. The night air was cool, stars sharp overhead in the clear spring sky. The proposal really is important, he said as she unlocked her door. Not just to me, but to the whole community. The cardiothoracic wing would serve 5 counties. People currently drive 2 hours to get that level of care. I know, Dad. I've read the impact assessments. Emma turned to face him. But you need to understand something. There are dozens of communities with similarly compelling needs. My job is to determine which projects will create the greatest positive impact with finite resources. It's not unlike triage in your ER. He nodded thoughtfully. I trust your judgment, Emma, whatever you decide. He hesitated, then added, I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. The words hung in the night air between them. Emma felt a sudden sting of tears that she quickly blinked away. Thank you. That means something, coming from you. The next morning, Emma met with her team at their hotel. I want to review the Lakeside proposal one more time alongside our other current applications, she told them. Let's be thorough. Her team spread out the materials for 6 pending hospital proposals across the conference table. For the next several hours, they compared metrics: population served, current access to specialized care, financial sustainability, community impact, innovation potential. Lakeside Memorial's proposal was strong. Her father's medical contributions were genuinely impressive, and the need was well documented. But as they worked through the analysis, it became increasingly clear that another proposal, from a rural hospital in Appalachia with no advanced cardiac care within 100 miles, presented a more compelling case for immediate funding. The numbers don't lie, Emma's financial analyst said, pointing to their comparison spreadsheet. Lakeside serves a community that already has decent cardiac care options within a 50-mile radius. The Mills County proposal would bring first-time access to populations currently completely underserved. Emma nodded, feeling a mixture of professional certainty and personal conflict. You're right. Mills County will create greater impact per dollar invested. She took a deep breath. Let's prepare the recommendation for Mills County as our primary funding target for this quarter. We'll put Lakeside in our second-tier recommendations for potential funding next fiscal year, with suggestions for strengthening their proposal. Are you sure? Her senior advisor asked carefully. Given your personal connection? That's exactly why we need to be objective, Emma interrupted firmly. My father would be the first to tell you that medical decisions can't be based on personal feelings. Financial ones shouldn't be either. The next day, Emma requested a meeting with the Lakeside Memorial Board to deliver her preliminary findings. She arrived at the hospital to find her father waiting in the lobby, anxiety evident in the set of his shoulders. The board's assembled in the conference room, he said. Everyone's quite excited. Emma maintained her professional demeanor. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is just a preliminary assessment. The boardroom fell silent as she entered. Mr. Blackwell rose to greet her, his expression hopeful. Ms. Wright, we're eager to hear your thoughts on our proposal. Thank you for accommodating this meeting on short notice, Emma began, setting her materials on the table. My team has conducted a thorough analysis of your proposal alongside other current applications for funding. She walked them through the evaluation process, explaining the metrics they used and how Lakeside compared to other facilities. She could see her father's expression changing as she continued, a growing realization of where this was heading. Lakeside Memorial has presented a strong proposal with clear benefits to the community, Emma said, reaching the conclusion. However, based on our comparative impact analysis, we cannot recommend it for primary funding in the current cycle. The disappointment in the room was palpable. Mr. Blackwell leaned forward. May I ask why? Emma displayed the comparison chart she'd prepared. Several factors. While your proposal would enhance existing cardiac care in the region, we've identified other communities with no current access to similar services. Our mission prioritizes bringing critical care to underserved populations first, then enhancing services in areas with existing options. She glanced at her father, whose face remained carefully neutral. Additionally, we believe the proposal could be strengthened in several areas. She detailed specific recommendations for improving future submissions, highlighting the hospital's strengths while pointing out opportunities for a more competitive application. We will be recommending Lakeside for consideration in our next funding cycle, provided these adjustments are made, she concluded. My team would be happy to consult with you on refining your approach. The meeting continued with questions from board members, some disappointed but most engaging constructively with her recommendations. Throughout, her father remained silent, his expression unreadable. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Blackwell sighed heavily. Well, this isn't the news we hoped for, but we appreciate your thoroughness, Ms. Wright. We'll certainly take your recommendations under advisement for our next submission. Board members filed out gradually, several stopping to thank Emma for her time despite their disappointment. Eventually, only she and her father remained in the conference room. "You're not funding us," he said quietly. "Not this cycle," Emma corrected. "The proposal has merit, but other communities have greater immediate need." He was silent for a long moment, then asked, "If I weren't your father, would the decision have been different?" "No," Emma replied without hesitation. "The analysis is objective. The numbers spoke for themselves." She met his gaze steadily. "Would you want me to make a different decision because of our relationship?" Her father considered this, then slowly shook his head. "No, that wouldn't be right." He gathered his papers. "Your mother won't be pleased. She was already planning how to redecorate my office in the new wing." Emma smiled slightly. "Tell her I'm sorry to disappoint." Her father looked up sharply at her choice of words, then his expression softened. "You've never been a disappointment, Emma. I was wrong to say that. Watching you these past few days, your professionalism, your knowledge, your integrity, I'm humbled." Emma felt a weight she had carried for years begin to lift. "Thank you for saying that. Do you really think we have a chance in the next funding cycle?" he asked. "Absolutely. The core proposal is sound, with some adjustments to focus more on bringing specialized services to currently unserved communities in the outlying counties. It could be very competitive." Her father nodded thoughtfully. "I might have some ideas about that. There's a mobile diagnostic unit approach we could incorporate." His eyes lit up with the enthusiasm she remembered from childhood when he discussed medical innovations. "Would you be willing to review some preliminary thoughts before we develop the full proposal?" "I'd be happy to," Emma replied, surprised by his adaptability. "Though I should disclose any consultations to avoid conflicts of interest." "Always the professional," he said, but his tone held respect rather than the dismissiveness it might have carried days ago. "I'm learning a lot from you, Emma. Things I should have learned years ago." As they walked together through the hospital corridors, Emma noticed how staff members greeted her father with genuine respect and affection. For all his flaws in their personal relationship, he was clearly valued here, his expertise recognized and appreciated. She understood suddenly that his identity was as wrapped up in being a respected doctor as hers was in being a successful financial executive. His dismissal of her career had been partly about his inability to value what he didn't understand, but also about his fear that her different path somehow rejected his life's work. "You know," she said as they reached the lobby, "our fields are more connected than I think either of us realized. We're both trying to help people, just from different angles." Her father considered this. "I focus on the individual patient in front of me. You see the bigger systems that make my work possible." He smiled slightly. "Maybe if I'd understood that sooner, I'd have been a better father to you." "It's not too late to try," Emma said quietly. The next morning, as Emma prepared to return to New York, her phone rang with a call from Mr. Blackwell. "Ms. Wright, I wanted to thank you again for your candid feedback yesterday." "It's my job to be thorough," she replied. "Yes, well, your father came to me immediately after the meeting with some rather innovative suggestions for revising our approach. He mentioned something about mobile diagnostic units for rural communities. I've never seen him so energized about the administrative side of medicine." Emma smiled. "He's always been passionate about patient care. This just extends that reach. He mentioned that you two might collaborate, in a properly disclosed professional capacity, of course, on refining our next submission." Mr. Blackwell paused. "He speaks of you quite differently now, you know. There's a pride there that wasn't evident before." After ending the call, Emma sat quietly in her hotel room, reflecting on the unexpected shifts of the past week and day. Had come to Lakeside hoping finally to earn her father's respect, and had ended up discovering she no longer needed it the way she once had. The validation she had craved had come, but it had come because she had stood firmly in her own professional identity, not because she had bent to his expectations. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Coffee before you leave town? I have some thoughts about medical outreach satellites that could use a financial reality check." Emma smiled and replied, "Business meeting with my father? That's new. Meet you at Riverside Cafe in 30. As she gathered her things, Emma realized that the most surprising outcome of this week wasn't that her father now saw her differently. It was that she saw herself differently too. She had proven her worth not just to him, but more importantly, to herself. The lingering doubt that had shadowed even her greatest professional achievements, that voice whispering she had somehow chosen wrong, disappointed her family, failed to live up to her potential, had finally fallen silent. She was Emma Wright, Senior Vice President at Meridian Capital, respected financial strategist, and, as it turned out, her father's daughter after all. Not because she had followed his path, but because she had forged her own with the same determination, excellence, and integrity that he had brought to his. And that, she realized as she drove toward the cafe where her father waited, was a legacy worth building. The Riverside Cafe sat nestled against the banks of the Lakeside River, its wide windows offering views of the water and the old footbridge that had become something of a town landmark. Emma arrived early, selecting a quiet corner table where she spread out her notes on rural healthcare delivery models. This was familiar territory for her, preparing meticulously, arming herself with data for any interaction with her father. She ordered a cappuccino and watched the door, surprising herself with the realization that she was looking forward to this meeting. Not because she needed to prove anything anymore, but because she was genuinely curious about her father's ideas. The professional respect developing between them felt like unexplored territory, exciting and somewhat uncertain. Dr. Richard Wright arrived precisely on time, as was his habit. He spotted Emma immediately and made his way through the morning crowd, looking different somehow in casual clothes, rather than his usual suit or surgical scrubs. More human, Emma thought. More like her father than the intimidating Dr. Wright. "I ordered your regular," Emma said as he sat down, nodding toward the black coffee that arrived at their table. Surprise flickered across his face. "You remembered how I take my coffee." "Some details stick with you," she replied with a slight smile. "Even when you leave home." He took a sip, then pulled out a folder of his own. "I've been up half the night thinking about your feedback. It's been years since I've been this engaged with the administrative side of medicine." "Meaning you usually leave that to people like me?" Emma said, raising an eyebrow. Her father chuckled. "Exactly. But your analysis yesterday, it made me see things from a different perspective." He opened his folder, revealing hand-drawn diagrams and notes. "You said our weakness was that we're proposing enhanced services in an area with existing options, while other communities have no access at all." "That's right. The impact per dollar invested is simply higher when you're bringing first-time access to underserved populations. So I started thinking about how we could restructure to address that." He pushed the diagrams toward her. "What if, instead of expanding only our central facility, we created satellite diagnostic centers in the rural counties to our east? Mobile units that could provide initial cardiac screenings and telemedicine connections to our specialists." Emma studied the drawings with genuine interest. The capital investment would be lower than building additional wings, and the reach would be significantly wider. "Exactly. We'd bring first-level cardiac care to communities that currently have nothing, and only transport patients to our main facility for procedures that actually require our specialized equipment." For the next hour, they brainstormed. Together, Emma applying her financial expertise to his medical insights. She pointed out cost efficiencies and potential funding structures. He identified clinical priorities and logistical challenges. They debated respectfully, challenged each other's assumptions, and gradually shaped a vision that was stronger than either could have developed alone. "You know," her father said as they ordered a second round of coffee, "in 30 years of medicine, I've sat through countless meetings with hospital administrators and financial officers. None of them could explain concepts as clearly as you just did." "Well, most of them probably didn't grow up learning medical terminology at the dinner table," Emma replied. "I've had years of translating between these worlds." Her father leaned back, studying her with new eyes. "Is that what drove you toward healthcare investment? Some connection to the family business, after all?" Emma considered the question. "Partly, maybe. I understood the industry in ways my business school classmates didn't. But honestly, I was drawn to the impact. Financial decisions in healthcare directly affect people's lives, whether a rural clinic stays open, whether a hospital can afford new life-saving equipment. Making money that makes a difference," her father mused. "Something like that." Emma hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered for years. "Did you ever actually look into what I do, Dad, before this week?" Her father's gaze dropped to his coffee. "Not really. I assumed I understood it well enough." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "That was arrogance on my part. The same arrogance that led me to call you disappointment." He stumbled over the word, clearly regretting it now. "Why was it so important that I follow your path?" Emma asked quietly. "Olivia did. Wasn't one daughter in medicine enough?" Her father was silent for a long moment. "Your grandfather, my father, was a brilliant surgeon, one of the pioneers in cardiac procedures in the 60s. I grew up worshiping him, determined to carry on his legacy." He traced the rim of his coffee cup thoughtfully. "When I had children, I assumed they would feel the same way about medicine, about me, that I felt about my father." "But I didn't," Emma said. "No, you questioned everything, always looking at situations from angles I hadn't considered. When you chose business over medicine, I took it as rejection of the path I'd laid out, of the values I thought I'd instilled." "It wasn't rejection," Emma said softly. "It was just finding my own way. I see that now." He straightened in his chair. "The irony is, you're more like my father than you know." He approached medicine with the same analytical mind you bring to finance, always questioning established practices, looking for better systems. Emma felt an unexpected warmth at being compared to the grandfather she barely remembered. "I wish I'd known him better." "He would have understood you," her father said with certainty. "Better than I did." As they gathered their notes, Emma's phone rang. Marcus from her New York office. "Emma, sorry to interrupt your trip, but we've got a situation with the Mills County proposal," he said when she answered. "What kind of situation?" she asked, immediately shifting to professional mode. Their land acquisition fell through. The parcel they were planning to build on has unexpected environmental issues. They're scrambling to find an alternative site, but it will delay the project by at least 18 months. Emma's mind raced through the implications. That changes the timeline for impact significantly. Exactly. The community would still be without cardiac care during that period. The board is asking if we should reconsider our recommendations for this funding cycle. Emma glanced at her father, who was pretending not to listen while gathering his papers. "I'll need to review all the proposals again with this new information. Can you have the team prepare updated impact analyses factoring in the delay?" "Already on it. Do you want us to schedule an emergency committee meeting for tomorrow when you're back?" "Yes," Emma confirmed. 10 a.m. at the office. Thanks, Marcus." She ended the call to find her father watching her with undisguised interest. "Problems with your chosen proposal?" "Significant delays," Emma admitted, "which affects the impact calculation that put it ahead of Lakeside's proposal." "Meaning our project might be back in contention?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Potentially. I'll need to reassess all the applications. She began gathering her materials. I should head back to New York sooner than planned. Her father nodded. Of course. Duty calls. As they walked out of the cafe together, Emma found herself unexpectedly reluctant to leave. This new dynamic between them, professional equals, collaborators, felt valuable, worth exploring further. I'll let you know what the committee decides, she said as they reached her rental car. I appreciate that. He hesitated, then added, whatever the outcome, I'm grateful for your insights this morning. The Mobile Diagnostic Center concept has merit regardless of whether it gets funded this cycle. It does, Emma agreed. And if you develop it further, I'd be happy to review the approach, professionally speaking. I'd like that. He shifted, awkwardly, then surprised her by offering a hug, something he rarely initiated. Safe travels, Emma. The drive back to New York gave Emma time to process the seismic shifts in her relationship with her father. For years, she had defined herself partly in opposition to him, proving she could succeed outside the path he prescribed. Now that the tension between them had eased, she found herself wondering how this would affect her own sense of identity. Back in her Manhattan office the next morning, Emma led her team through a comprehensive reassessment of the remaining proposals. With Mills County's project delayed, the comparative impact calculations shifted significantly. Based on the updated timeline analysis, 2 proposals now show comparable impact potential, her analyst explained, highlighting the data. Lakeside Memorial and Central Detroit Medical Center. Emma studied the numbers carefully. Detroit's infrastructure costs are considerably higher, correct? Yes. The urban location increases construction expenses by about 20%. They'd serve a higher population density, but at a higher cost per patient. Emma turned to her senior advisor. And Lakeside's proposal? If we incorporated the Mobile Diagnostic Center concept Dr. Wright suggested? We ran preliminary numbers, he replied, pulling up a new spreadsheet. It actually improves their impact metrics considerably. The outreach to rural communities addresses our concerns about duplicating services in already served areas. For the next 3 hours, the team debated the merits of each proposal, analyzing community impact, financial sustainability, and alignment with the fund's mission. Emma was careful to maintain objectivity, acknowledging her personal connection while focusing on the data before them. By mid-afternoon, the committee had reached consensus. Emma picked up the phone to call the Lakeside Memorial Board. Mr. Blackwell answered on the first ring. Ms. Wright, this is unexpected. We weren't anticipating hearing from you so soon. Circumstances have changed with another proposal we were considering, Emma explained. My committee has completed a reassessment of all applications in our current cycle. I see, he said cautiously. And where does that leave Lakeside? The committee has voted to recommend Lakeside Memorial for funding, with one significant modification. We're interested in the integrated mobile diagnostic center concept rather than solely expanding the main facility. There was a pause. The mobile diagnostic centers? That's Dr. Wright's new idea. He just presented it to us this morning. Yes. We believe it represents a more innovative approach to expanding cardiac care access throughout your service region. This is surprising news, Mr. Blackwell said, his voice warming with excitement. Very welcome, of course. Dr. Wright will be particularly pleased. He was quite passionate about the concept in our meeting. The formal offer will be sent this afternoon, with details on funding structures and timelines. We'd want to commence within 6 weeks. After completing the call, Emma sat quietly at her desk, contemplating the outcome. The decision had been made on the merits. She was certain of that. The modified Lakeside proposal genuinely represented the best investment of their resources. Yet she couldn't deny the personal satisfaction of being able to deliver good news to her father's hospital. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Just heard from Blackwell. Is it true? She replied simply, "The committee voted based on the modified proposal's merits. Congratulations." 3 dots appeared as he typed, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "Thank you. This means a great deal to many people here." Emma was about to set her phone down when it buzzed again. "And thank you for listening to my idea yesterday. It means a great deal to me personally." That weekend, Emma returned to Lakeside for the formal announcement of the funding grant. The hospital had organized a small reception in the atrium with board members, medical staff, and local officials in attendance. Standing at the back of the room, Emma watched as Mr. Blackwell addressed the gathering, outlining how the project would transform cardiac care in the region. And none of this would be possible without the vision of our chief of surgery, Dr. Richard Wright. Mr. Blackwell continued, gesturing for her father to join him at the podium. His innovative concept for mobile diagnostic units dramatically strengthened our proposal. Her father stepped forward, accepting the acknowledgement with a brief nod. "I appreciate the recognition, but I can't take full credit for the concept." He scanned the room until his eyes found Emma. The Mobile Diagnostic Center approach evolved from discussions with someone who helped me see healthcare delivery from a different perspective. My daughter, Emma Wright. Heads turned in her direction, and Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. This public acknowledgement from her father was unprecedented. "Emma is the senior vice president at Meridian Capital who ultimately approved our funding," he continued. "But before that decision was made, she took the time to help me understand what would make our proposal stronger. Not as my daughter, but as a healthcare finance expert whose insight I've come to greatly respect." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people made the connection between the Wright name on the surgeon and the Meridian Capital executive. "I'd like to invite Emma to say a few words about Meridian's vision for this project," her father concluded, extending his hand toward her. Surprised, Emma made her way to the podium. As she passed her father, he whispered, "They should hear from the person who made this possible." Standing before the gathering, Emma spoke briefly about Meridian's commitment to expanding healthcare, access, the metrics that had made Lakeside's revised proposal compelling, and the potential impact on surrounding communities. Throughout her remarks, she noticed her father watching her with an expression she had rarely seen directed her way, one of unmistakable pride. After the formal presentations, as attendees mingled over refreshments, Emma found herself approached by doctors and board members eager to discuss the project further. She fielded questions with the same confidence she brought to boardroom presentations, aware of her father observing from across the room. Eventually, he made his way to her side. "You handled Dr. Harrison's technical questions better than most medical administrators I know," he commented. "I've funded enough cardiac care projects to pick up the terminology," she replied with a smile. "It's more than terminology. You understand the underlying purpose, what these investments actually mean for patient care." He lowered his voice. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the cafe, about how you translate between the medical and financial worlds. What about it? There's a national conference next month on healthcare funding innovations. I've been invited to speak about hospital investor partnerships, but I think they'd benefit more from hearing from someone who truly understands both sides." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we present together? If you're interested, your perspective combined with my clinical experience could make for a compelling presentation." Emma considered the proposal. A year ago, the idea of a professional collaboration with her father would have seemed impossible, fraught with the same tension and dismissiveness that had characterized their personal relationship. Now, it felt like an intriguing possibility. "I'd need to check my schedule," she said, "but yes, I'd be interested." Her father smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good. I'll send you the details." Later that evening, at another family dinner, Emma noticed subtle but significant changes. Her father directed questions about her work to her throughout the meal, engaging with her responses rather than merely tolerating them before turning to Olivia. When Emma mentioned an upcoming investment review, he asked intelligent follow-up, questions that showed he had been paying attention to her explanations of the process. After dinner, as Emma helped her mother with the dishes, Catherine observed quietly, "I've never seen your father so interested in what you do." "It's new territory for both of us," Emma admitted. "He called one of his colleagues this morning to boast about your role at Meridian," her mother confided. "I've heard him brag about Olivia's surgical skills dozens of times, but this was the first time I've heard that tone of pride when talking about your career." Emma paused, a plate suspended between sink and cabinet. "Really?" Catherine nodded. "He's finally seeing what I've always seen, that you're extraordinary in your own way, not less than because you chose a different path." From the living room, they heard Olivia laugh at something their father said. A moment later, he called, "Emma, come settle an argument. Olivia doesn't believe that investment decisions for medical technology can actually accelerate FDA approvals." "Oh, she's wrong about that," Emma called back, sharing a smile with her mother as she dried her hands and went to join them. As discussions of medical financing and regulatory pathways filled the evening, Emma realized something had fundamentally shifted. For years, she had sought her father's approval while simultaneously resenting that she needed it. Now that it had come, not because she had conformed to his expectations, but because he had expanded his understanding, she found it meant something different than she had anticipated. It wasn't about validation anymore. It was about connection, about finally being able to share her authentic self with her family and being seen for who she truly was. The following month, Emma and her father presented together at the healthcare funding conference. Standing side by side at the podium, they offered complementary perspectives on bridging the gap between medical innovation and financial sustainability. Their presentation received a standing ovation, with attendees particularly noting the rare combination of clinical and investment expertise. Afterward, as they gathered their materials, a hospital CEO approached them. "Dr. Wright, Ms. Wright, that was remarkable. The medical financial gap is something we struggle with daily. Have you considered consulting together? Many institutions would benefit from your combined perspective." They exchanged glances, a moment of silent communication passing between them. "We're just beginning to explore the possibilities of collaboration," her father replied. "But we're open to discussions," Emma added. Later, over dinner at the hotel restaurant, they considered the suggestion. "It would be complicated with our primary responsibilities," Emma noted, "but perhaps as a limited side project." Her father nodded thoughtfully. "A few select consultations per year. We could be selective, focus on projects with significant community impact." "Wright and Wright Healthcare Advisors," Emma said with a smile. "It has a certain symmetry to it." "Indeed it does." Her father raised his glass in a toast. "To unexpected partnerships." As they clinked glasses, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From "you'll always be the disappointment" to professional equals in less than a year, a transformation neither could have predicted. That night, as Emma prepared for bed in her hotel room, her phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Dad just called me raving about your presentation. Said watching you handle the investment questions was like watching a virtuoso. Who is this man, and what has he done with our father?" Emma smiled, typing back, "Evolution, apparently. Some species can adapt after all." She set her phone aside and gazed out at the city lights beyond her window. Her father's approval, once so desperately sought and painfully withheld, had finally come. Yet the true victory wasn't winning his respect. It was discovering that somewhere along the way, she had developed such a strong sense of her own worth that his validation, while welcome, was no longer essential to her identity. "You'll always be the disappointment," he had said that night at dinner. the words that had cut so deeply at the time. Now they seemed like artifacts from another lifetime, relevant only as markers of how far they both had come. The real story wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about finding the strength to define success on her own terms, and in doing so, creating space for a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than unmet expectations. Tomorrow they would return to their respective worlds, she to her Manhattan office, he to his operating room. But something essential had changed. The chasm that had separated them for so long had been bridged, not by her crossing over to his territory or him to hers, but by both recognizing the value in the territory between, the place where their different perspectives could create something stronger together than either could achieve alone. 6 months after the healthcare funding conference, Emma sat in her corner office in Manhattan, reviewing quarterly performance reports for Meridian's Healthcare Innovation Fund. Under her leadership, the fund had expanded its portfolio by 30%, with particular growth in rural healthcare access initiatives inspired by the Lakeside Memorial model. The mobile diagnostic centers had proven so successful that 3 other hospitals had implemented similar programs with Meridian's backing. A light knock at her door interrupted her concentration. Her assistant Marcus stood in the doorway. "Your 2:00 is here," he announced. Emma checked her watch, surprised the afternoon had progressed so quickly. "Send them in, please." Moments later, Dr. Elaine Chen, Chief Medical Officer at Central Detroit Medical Center, entered her office. Emma had been cultivating this relationship for months, hoping to bring Meridian's investment strategies to Detroit's underserved communities. "Dr. Chen, welcome to New York," Emma greeted her, extending her hand. "I hope your flight was comfortable." "As comfortable as commercial aviation gets these days," Dr. Chen replied with a wry smile. "But worth it. I'm eager to discuss how our organizations might work together." As they settled into the comfortable seating area by the window, Emma noticed Dr. Chen glancing at the framed photograph on her credenza, a recent addition showing Emma and her father at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Lakeside's first mobile diagnostic unit. "That's the Lakeside Memorial project, isn't it?" Dr. Chen asked. "It's become something of a case study in innovative healthcare delivery. The lead surgeon there has been speaking at conferences about it." "Yes," Emma said with a small smile. "That's my father, actually, Dr. Richard Wright." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "Your father? I had no idea. I heard him speak at the AMA convention last month. He was quite emphatic about the role of strategic investment in transforming patient access." "That's a relatively new perspective for him," Emma admitted. Their meeting proceeded productively, with Emma outlining Meridian's approach to urban healthcare investment and Dr. Chen detailing Central Detroit's vision for community-based preventive care centers. As they worked through potential funding structures, Emma found herself applying insights gleaned from her ongoing consultations with her father, explaining complex financial mechanisms in terms that resonated with the clinician's priorities. "You have a remarkable ability to translate between our worlds," Dr. Chen commented as they concluded. "Most financial executives I meet either oversimplify medical considerations or drown me in jargon." "I've had good practice recently," Emma replied. "My father and I have developed something of a side project bridging these perspectives." After Dr. Chen departed, Emma returned to her desk, making notes on their discussion. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Mobile Unit Number 3 launched today. 47 patients seen. 3 critical cases identified for immediate transfer. System working as designed." She smiled, texting back, "Excellent numbers. On track with projections. How's the new cardiac fellow adapting to the rural rotation?" His response came quickly, complaining about the lack of decent coffee but otherwise performing admirably. "When can I expect your quarterly visit?" Emma checked her calendar. "Thursday next week." "Board presentation at 10? Lunch after?" "Perfect. Mom insists you stay for dinner. Olivia will be home too." These family dinners had become regular events rather than dreaded obligations. The conversation now flowed naturally between medical discussions and financial insights, with each family member's expertise respected and valued. Even more surprisingly, Emma and her father had developed a habit of sending each other relevant articles and case studies, he sharing medical innovations that might interest her investors, she sending him analyses of healthcare funding trends that could affect his hospital. 2 days later, Emma was presenting to Meridian's executive committee when her assistant slipped into the back of the boardroom, a concerned expression on his face. He caught her eye and subtly motioned for her attention. Emma smoothly directed the committee to review a data set, then stepped away from the podium. "What is it, Marcus?" she asked quietly. "Emergency call from your mother," he whispered. "Your father collapsed during surgery. They've taken him to the cardiac unit at Lakeside." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "I need to go. Now." "I've already arranged for the company jet," Marcus replied. "Car's waiting downstairs." Emma turned back to the boardroom, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will. "Gentlemen, ladies, I apologize, but I've been called away on an urgent family matter. Mr. Donnelly will continue the presentation." The 3-hour flight to Lakeside was the longest of Emma's life. She attempted to work, to distract herself with fund projections and investment analyses, but her mind kept circling back to her father. Their relationship had only just transformed into something meaningful. The thought of losing him now was unbearable. Her mother met her at the hospital entrance, eyes red-rimmed but composed. "He's stabilized," Catherine said, embracing her daughter. "Massive heart attack, mid-surgery. If it hadn't happened in a hospital surrounded by cardiac specialists." Emma nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. "What's his prognosis?" "They're cautiously optimistic. He's scheduled for bypass surgery tomorrow morning. Dr. Anderson, his colleague from Johns Hopkins, is flying in to perform it." They made their way to the cardiac intensive care unit, where Olivia sat beside their father's bed, monitoring his vital signs with professional detachment that didn't quite mask her worry. Dr. Richard Wright looked small against the white sheets, a maze of tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped steadily. "Emma's here, Dad," Olivia said, softly. Their father's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Emma. A ghost of his usual confident smile crossed his face. "Sorry about the dramatic entrance," he whispered hoarsely. Emma moved to his side, taking his hand carefully around the IV lines. "Typical surgeon," she said, forcing lightness into her voice. "Always has to be the center of attention." He chuckled weakly, then winced. "Not how I planned to spend the week." "You should have seen him," Olivia said, adjusting his oxygen. "Finished the valve replacement even after the first chest pains started, then calmly told his team he needed a cardiologist before collapsing. The patient was already open on the table," he murmured. "Couldn't just walk away?" Emma squeezed his hand gently. Always the hero. His eyes held hers, suddenly serious. "Emma, if something happens tomorrow—" "Nothing's going to happen," she interrupted firmly. "Listen," he insisted. "The joint consulting project we've been discussing, Wright and Wright Healthcare Advisors, there's a folder in my home office with all my notes and contacts. Promise me you'll move forward with it, with or without me." Emma's throat tightened. "We'll move forward with it together, once you're recovered." He nodded slightly, his energy visibly fading. "Good, that's good." The next few hours passed, in a blur of medical consultations and family discussions. Olivia, in her element, translated the complex cardiac terminology for Emma and their mother. As evening approached, the nurses suggested they get some rest before tomorrow's surgery. "You two go home," Emma said to her mother and sister. "I'll stay tonight." "Emma, you just flew in," her mother began. "I'm staying," Emma repeated gently but firmly. After they left, Emma settled into the chair beside her father's bed. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the monitoring equipment. Her father drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally opening his eyes to find her still there. During one such moment of wakefulness, he studied her face in the dim light. "You should be in New York," he said softly. "Running your empire." "My team can handle things for a few days," she replied. "This is where I need to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I never understood that before, that some things are more important than work, even important work." Emma smiled sadly. "You're learning. Too late, perhaps." "No," she said firmly, "not too late." The night passed slowly. Emma attended to emails on her tablet, coordinated with her office, and made necessary arrangements to be away indefinitely. Occasionally, a nurse would come in to check vitals and adjust medications. Around 3 in the morning, her father woke, again, more alert than before. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. "Thinking about time, how quickly it passes." His eyes traveled around the hospital room. "I've spent my life in rooms like this, on the other side of the equation. Never really considered what it feels like from this perspective." Emma set aside her tablet. "And how does it feel?" "Humbling," he admitted. "All those years I acted as though being a surgeon made me somehow superior to patients, to administrators, to anyone in a different field." His gaze found hers. "To you." "Dad, you don't need to—" "I do," he interrupted gently. "I do need to say this, Emma, in case I don't get another chance." She swallowed hard but nodded for him to continue. "I was wrong about what matters. Wrong about what constitutes meaningful work, meaningful life. I measured everything against a single standard, my standard, and missed so much." He took a labored breath. "I missed you, the real you, for years." Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "We've moved past that." "Yes, but I need you to know that I see it now. How extraordinary you are. How proud I am." His voice grew fainter. "Not because you've proven yourself to me, but because you never needed to in the first place." In the semi-darkness of the hospital room, something shifted between them. A final letting go of old wounds, a quiet acknowledgement of new understanding. "Get some rest," Emma said softly. "You have surgery in a few hours." He nodded, eyes already closing. "Stay," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. Dawn brought a flurry of activity as the medical team prepared for surgery. Dr. Anderson arrived, conferring briefly with Olivia about the procedure while nurses readied equipment and medications. Emma and her mother stood back, watching the efficiency of the hospital machine spring into motion around the man who had always been its driving force. Just before they wheeled him to the operating room, Richard reached for Emma's hand. "Remember what I said? The folder in my office." "I remember," she assured him. "But you'll be telling me all about it yourself this afternoon." The surgery lasted 6 hours. Emma, her mother, and Olivia waited together in a private consultation room, each coping in her own way. Catherine alternating between nervous chatter and silent prayer. Olivia periodically checking in with surgical colleagues for updates. Emma methodically answering work emails to keep her mind occupied. When Dr. Anderson finally appeared, still in surgical scrubs, his expression was cautiously positive. "He came through well," he reported. "The damage was extensive, but we've bypassed the blockages and restored good blood flow. The next 48 hours will be critical, but I'm optimistic." The collective relief in the room was palpable. "When can we see him?" Catherine asked. "He'll be in recovery for another hour, then back in CCU. You can see him briefly once he's settled." The next 2 days passed in a vigilant routine, with family members taking shifts at the hospital while attempting to maintain some semblance of normal life. Emma set up a temporary office in an unused hospital meeting room, conducting video conferences between visits to her father's bedside. On the third day, Richard was strong enough to be moved out of intensive care to a private room. His color was better, his voice stronger, though he tired easily and chafed at the restrictions on his movement. "When can I get back to work?" he asked Dr. Anderson during morning rounds. The cardiologist fixed him with a stern look. "Richard, you nearly died on the operating table. You're looking at months of recovery, not days. And when you do return, your schedule will need significant modification." "Months?" Richard protested. "The cardiac department can't run itself for months." "It won't have to," Emma said from the doorway where she'd been listening. "The hospital board has already approved an interim leadership structure. Dr. Winters will oversee surgical services, with consultation from Johns Hopkins as needed." Her father frowned. "How do you know what the board approved?" "Because I was in the meeting this morning," Emma replied, entering the room fully. "They asked for my input on transitional leadership models." Dr. Anderson nodded approvingly. "Your daughter has been quite helpful in reassuring both the board and our financial partners that this temporary situation won't affect hospital operations or funding." After the doctor left, Richard studied Emma with newfound appreciation. "You've been managing the hospital politics while I've been out of commission." She shrugged slightly. "Just applying basic crisis management principles. The hospital needed reassurance that your medical team and their funding would remain stable. And you provided that reassurance." He shook his head in wonder. "The daughter I once called a disappointment is now holding my life's work together in my absence." Emma pulled a chair beside his bed. "The hospital is more than your life's work, Dad. It's a community institution that needs stable leadership and funding regardless of any individual, even you. A systemic view," he noted with a small smile. "Always your strength." "Which complements your strength in individual patient care," she countered. "Neither perspective is superior. They're complementary." Over the next few weeks, Richard's recovery progressed steadily, though not as quickly as he would have liked. Emma extended her stay in Lakeside, working remotely while helping her mother manage her father's care and the inevitable adjustment to their new reality. One afternoon, she decided to retrieve the mysterious folder her father had mentioned the night before his surgery. In his home office, she found a meticulously organized space that reflected his surgical precision. The sigh. Folder sat prominently on his desk, labeled simply Wright and Wright. Opening it, Emma discovered detailed notes on potential healthcare consulting opportunities, hospitals seeking guidance on funding structures, medical schools interested in financial literacy programs for physicians, even a draft proposal for a book on bridging the gap between clinical and financial decision-making in healthcare. At the very back was a handwritten letter addressed to her. The date indicated he had written it months ago, long before his heart attack. With a sense of curiosity, Emma began to read. "Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, our joint venture has either become a formal reality or something has happened to me before we could fully realize this vision together. Either way, I want you to know that the concept of Wright and Wright represents much more than a business opportunity to me. It represents reconciliation, the bringing together of two worlds I once believed were separate and unequal." Emma settled into her father's desk chair, continuing to read his reflections on how their professional collaboration had changed his perspective, not just on her career, but on his own. He wrote of regret for the years lost to his narrow-mindedness, and hope for a future where their complementary expertise might benefit healthcare delivery for patients who would never know the story behind their partnership. "Whether or not this specific venture succeeds," the letter concluded, "please know that working alongside you, seeing your brilliance, your compassion, your strategic mind in action, has been one of the great privileges of my life. You were never a disappointment, Emma. The disappointment was mine alone, in failing to see the extraordinary woman you became without my guidance, perhaps even because of my absence. With profound respect and love, Dad." Emma sat quietly for a long moment after finishing the letter, emotions washing over her in waves. The acknowledgement she had craved for so long had been here, written months ago, without the drama of a hospital bedside or the pressure of a life-threatening situation. A soft knock at the office door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find her father standing in the doorway, leaning on a walking cane, his first venture downstairs since returning home from the hospital. "You found it?" he said, nodding toward the folder. "I did." Emma held up the letter. "This too." He moved carefully into the room, lowering himself into a chair opposite her. "I meant every word." "I know." She carefully returned the letter to the folder. "The question is, what do we do now? Your recovery needs to be your priority." "My recovery gives us an opportunity," he replied. "I can't return to surgery for at least 6 months, maybe never with the same schedule. But my mind still works. My knowledge is intact." He gestured toward the folder. "This work, our work, could be my bridge to a different kind of contribution." Emma considered this. "You're proposing we actually launch Wright and Wright while you recover?" "On a limited basis, yes. Consulting remotely at first, then selective in-person engagements as I'm able." His eyes held a familiar determination, but tempered now with a new humility. "If you're willing, of course. You have your own career to consider." Emma thought about the past 6 months, how their professional collaboration had already transformed both her relationship with her father and her approach to healthcare investment, how the projects they had informally advised had benefited from their combined perspective. Meridian would need to approve any formal consulting arrangement, she said thoughtfully, to avoid conflicts of interest. Of course. And we'd need to be selective about which projects we take on, quality over quantity. He nodded, watching her work through the practical considerations. "It would mean regular travel back to Lakeside for me," she continued. "Or you to New York when you're able. Your mother would appreciate seeing more of you," he noted with a small smile. Emma looked up from her mental calculations to find her father watching her with an expression of patient hope. Not the demanding expectation she had grown up with, but something gentler. A request, not a requirement. "I think," she said slowly, "it could work. Not just work, it could be meaningful, important." The relief on his face was evident. "That's what I think too." 4 months later, Wright and Wright Healthcare Advisors officially launched with a small reception at Lakeside Memorial Hospital. The event brought together medical professionals and financial executives, two worlds that rarely intersected in meaningful dialogue. Emma stood at the podium, surveying the diverse gathering. Healthcare operates at the intersection of science, compassion, and economic reality, she began. Too often, these forces are seen as competing rather than complementary. Wright and Wright was founded on the belief that when clinical expertise and financial acumen work in genuine partnership, patient care improves and systems become more sustainable. She gestured toward her father, who sat nearby, still using a cane but looking remarkably recovered in his tailored suit. Dr. Richard Wright brings 40 years of surgical experience and hospital leadership to our team. His insight into clinical priorities ensures that financial decisions never lose sight of what matters most, the patient. Richard nodded in acknowledgement as approving murmurs rippled through the audience. Together, Emma continued, we offer a unique perspective on healthcare challenges, not as opposing forces, but as essential partners in building better systems. After the formal presentations, as guests mingled and exchanged cards, Emma found herself approached by a young medical student who had attended with one of the hospital administrators. "Ms. Wright," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to tell you how inspiring your partnership with your father is. I'm actually interested in both medicine and healthcare administration, but my advisors keep telling me I have to choose one path." Emma smiled, recognizing something of herself in the young woman's dilemma. What's your name? Sophia Martinez. Well, Sophia, 10 years ago, I would have agreed with your advisors. Today, I'd say the most innovative work happens at the boundaries between disciplines. She glanced across the room to where her father was engaged in animated conversation with a hospital finance director, a scene that would have been unimaginable a year ago. The world doesn't need more people who stay rigidly within traditional professional lanes, Emma continued. It needs bridge builders who understand multiple perspectives and can translate between them. Sophia nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what I want to do. Then don't let anyone tell you it's impossible. Emma handed her a business card. And when you're finishing your studies, call me. Wright might have an internship for someone with your inclusive vision. Later, as the event wound down, Emma found her father sitting quietly in a corner, observing the remaining conversations with a thoughtful expression. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, taking the seat beside him. "I was just thinking about legacies," he replied. "How we imagine them versus what they actually become." "And what conclusions have you reached?" He smiled softly. "That I spent decades building what I thought was my legacy, surgical innovations, department leadership, the respect of my peers. But it turns out, my most meaningful legacy might be something entirely unexpected." Wright? Emma suggested. "No." He turned to face her fully. "You, Emma. Not as a surgeon following in my footsteps as I once hoped, but as the remarkable woman you've become, someone who sees beyond artificial boundaries, who builds connections where others see only divisions." He gestured around the room. "All of this grew from your vision, your willingness to bridge worlds even after I dismissed the path you chose." Emma felt a sudden tightness in her throat. "We built this together." "Yes, but only after you showed me it was possible." He placed his hand over hers. "You were never the disappointment, Emma. You were always the visionary. I just couldn't see it until I was ready to look beyond my own narrow perspective." As they sat together, father and daughter, physician and financier, Emma thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From harsh words spoken across a dinner table to professional partners reshaping their corner of the healthcare landscape. The path had not been easy or straightforward, but its very complexity had created something neither could have built alone. "Ready to head home?" she asked as the last guests departed. "Mom said she's making your favorite for dinner." "Just one more minute," he said, gazing around the room that had transformed from a professional venue back to a hospital waiting area. "I want to remember this moment, the day Wright became official." Emma smiled, understanding the significance. This wasn't just the launch of a consulting practice. It was the formal recognition of a reconciliation, a new relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. "Take all the time you need," she said. "We've got plenty of it now." And in that quiet moment, both knew it was true. The disappointment was gone, replaced by appreciation. The judgment had faded, transformed into respect. What remained was a partnership neither had imagined possible, and all the stronger for the difficult journey that had forged it. 1 year after the official launch of Wright Healthcare Advisors, Emma stood at the window of their newly expanded offices in downtown Lakeside. The view overlooked the river where she and her father had shared that pivotal coffee conversation, the moment when their professional relationship first began to take shape. What had started as a limited consulting practice during her father's recovery had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Their client roster had grown steadily, with hospitals and medical centers across the country seeking their unique approach to integrating clinical excellence with financial sustainability. They had hired a small staff, 2 financial analysts, a healthcare policy expert, and an operations manager, while maintaining the personal touch that made their partnership distinctive. Emma checked her watch. Her father would be arriving soon for their weekly strategy meeting. Though she still maintained her position at Meridian Capital, carefully navigating potential conflicts of interest, she now split her time between New York and Lakeside, where Wright and Wright had become her primary professional focus. The door opened, and Richard Wright entered, moving with only the slightest hint of the gait change his cardiac surgery had left him with. At 63, he looked vibrant and engaged, having found a new professional identity that didn't rely on the physical stamina of surgery. "Morning," he greeted her, setting his briefcase on the conference table. "Ready for today's marathon?" Emma smiled. 7 client calls, 2 proposal reviews, and the Northwestern Medical Center presentation to finalize. Just another Thursday. Richard chuckled, pouring himself coffee from the pot their assistant had prepared. "Remember when I couldn't imagine life without performing surgery 5 days a week? Now I can barely find time to keep up with medical journals." "Speaking of which," Emma said, retrieving a folder from her desk, "the Journal of Healthcare Finance is interested in publishing our case study on the Rural Diagnostic Network model. They're calling it a paradigm shift in accessibility metrics." Her father raised an eyebrow. "My surgical colleagues would never believe I co-authored something in a finance journal. Just as my MBA classmates would be shocked to see my name on that cardiothoracic care pathway article in the Medical Leadership Quarterly," Emma countered with a smile. Their easy banter was interrupted by Emma's phone. She glanced at the screen. "It's Sophia Martinez. Mind if I take this?" Richard waved her ahead. "Our promising intern? By all means," Emma answered, listening intently for several minutes. "That's excellent news, Sophia. Yes, we'd be delighted to have you join us after graduation. We'll work around your residency schedule." After a few more exchanges, she ended the call, turning to her father with evident satisfaction. "She's accepted our offer," Emma announced. "She'll be our first medical resident consultant once she completes her MD MBA next spring." "The first of many, I hope," Richard replied, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. Her perspective on the Memphis proposal was remarkable for someone still in training. Emma nodded in agreement. "She reminds me of what might have been possible if I'd had encouragement to explore both medicine and finance from the beginning." There was a time when such a comment might have carried an accusatory edge, but now it was simply an observation, a reflection on how their shared work was creating opportunities neither had imagined. "Different paths, same destination," Richard said quietly. "Though I suspect you would have made an exceptional surgeon with those analytical skills. And you might have been a brilliant hospital CEO if you'd developed your administrative talents." "Earlier," Emma replied. Their assistant knocked lightly before entering. "Your 9 o'clock is here. Dr. Reynolds from Memorial Regional and their CFO, Mr. Daniels." "Show them in," Emma said, gathering her materials. The meeting with Memorial Regional exemplified the work that had become Wright and Wright's specialty, helping hospitals integrate clinical and financial decision-making in ways that served both patients and institutional sustainability. Dr. Reynolds, an experienced neurologist, and Mr. Daniels, a veteran healthcare financial officer, had operated in parallel universes within the same institution for years without finding common ground. "The problem is fundamental," Dr. Reynolds explained, frustration evident in his voice. "Every time we propose expanding neurology services to meet community needs, we're told it doesn't pencil out. Meanwhile, we lose patients to facilities 80 miles away." Mr. Daniels sighed. "And from my perspective, I can't justify investing millions in specialized equipment that might sit unused much of the time. The numbers simply don't work." Emma and Richard exchanged a glance, a moment of silent communication born from dozens of similar conversations. "You're both right," Richard said, "from within your respective frameworks. But there's a third perspective we might consider." Over the next 2 hours, they outlined an approach that reframed the question entirely. Not whether to expand neurology services in the traditional model, but how to create a flexible, scalable system that could adapt to variable patient needs. while maintaining financial viability. The mobile diagnostic concept we pioneered at Lakeside could be adapted for neurology, Emma explained, pulling up financial models on her tablet. Initial screening and basic procedures local, complex cases transferred, with technology bridging the gaps. And if we form a regional consortium with neighboring hospitals, Richard added, you can share both the investment costs and the specialized staff, creating a sustainable system that serves more patients without bankrupting any single institution. By meeting's end, the Memorial Regional team departed with renewed energy and a framework for collaboration rather than opposition. Emma watched them leave, a sense of satisfaction settling over her. We've gotten pretty good at this, she observed. Translating between worlds? Her father asked. It seems to be our specialty. As they prepared for their next appointment, Richard paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. You know, it's been exactly 1 year since our official launch. I hadn't forgotten, Emma assured him. Mom's planning that surprise dinner for you tonight that I'm not supposed to know about. He chuckled. Catherine was never good at keeping secrets, but I was thinking about something else. How dramatically life can change in a year. Emma settled into a chair, recognizing the reflective mood that occasionally overtook her father since his health crisis. From heart attack to thriving consultation practice in 12 months, it's been quite a journey. More than that, he said, joining her at the table. A year ago, I was still mourning the loss of my surgical career, still defining myself primarily as Dr. Wright, Chief of Surgery. I thought the most valuable contribution I could make was with a scalpel in my hand. Emma nodded, understanding. Professional identity is powerful. I remember how long it took me to stop measuring my success against the Wright family medical yardstick. That's just it, Richard said, leaning forward earnestly. I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we leave behind that truly matters. The Wright name on innovative surgical procedures isn't enough? Emma teased gently. He shook his head. Those contributions matter, but they're finite. What we're building here, this approach to healthcare that bridges disciplines, that teaches the next generation to think beyond traditional boundaries, that could outlast any surgical technique I pioneered. Emma felt a surge of emotion at his words. This man, who had once dismissed her career choice as inferior to medicine, was now finding deeper fulfillment in the very work they had created together, work that honored both their perspectives. I think you're right, she said simply. What we're doing matters. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their policy expert with updates on pending healthcare legislation that would affect several client projects. The day progressed. In its usual rhythm of calls, meetings, and strategic planning, the anniversary moment set aside but not forgotten. That evening, as predicted, Catherine had arranged a small celebration at their family home. Olivia had flown in for the weekend, bringing news of her upcoming fellowship appointment. The dinner conversation flowed easily between medical topics, financial considerations, and family updates, all discussed with equal interest and respect. As Catherine served coffee in the living room, Olivia raised her cup in an impromptu toast. To Wright and Wright, 1 year of bridging the unbridgeable, and to Dad, who survived a heart attack only to discover a second career even more influential than his first. Here, Emma added, clinking her cup against her father's. Richard looked around at his family, emotion evident in his eyes. I'm a fortunate man, he said quietly. Not just to have survived, but to have been given the chance to see what I was too blind to value before. Later, as Emma prepared to leave for her hotel, her father walked her to her car, just as he had on that pivotal night when he had first acknowledged his respect for her career. I've been meaning to ask you something, he said, hands in his pockets against the cool evening air. The Madison Hospital Group has invited me to speak at their annual leadership conference in September. The topic is integrating clinical and financial excellence in healthcare delivery. You'll be excellent, Emma assured him. Your perspective on this has evolved more than anyone I know. That's just it, he replied. I'd like us to present together, not as Wright and Wright promoting our services, but as father and daughter discussing our journey from professional disconnect to collaboration. The personal story behind the professional partnership. Emma considered the proposal they had presented together dozens of times over the past year, but always focusing on healthcare systems and strategies, carefully avoiding the more personal aspects of their relationship transformation. That would be a different kind of presentation, she said, thoughtfully. More vulnerable. Too vulnerable? He asked, watching her reaction carefully. Emma thought about the journey they had traveled, from his dismissive, "You'll always be the disappointment," to their current partnership of equals. There had been a time when she would have guarded that painful history, keeping it private rather than exposing it to professional scrutiny. But now, secure in both her accomplishments and their reconciliation, she saw the potential value in sharing it. No, she decided, not too vulnerable. If our story can help other families or colleagues bridge similar divides, it's worth telling. Relief and pleasure mingled in her father's expression. I was hoping you'd say that. The following weeks brought new challenges to Wright and Wright as their reputation spread. A prestigious academic medical center on the West Coast requested their input on restructuring their research funding model. A healthcare startup sought their guidance on integrating clinical priorities into their business plan. The governor's healthcare task force invited them to consult on a statewide rural access initiative modeled after their Lakeside success. Through it all, Emma and Richard refined their unique approach, his clinical expertise informing her financial strategies, her systemic perspective enhancing his patient-centered focus. Their staff joked about developing a translation dictionary between doctor speak and finance speak, noting how their bosses seemed to move effortlessly between these, often conflicting languages. As they prepared for the Madison conference, they decided to approach their father-daughter presentation differently than their usual professional talks. Rather than focusing solely on outcomes and metrics, they would share the personal journey that had brought them to their current partnership. We should be honest about how wrong I was, Richard insisted during their preparation session. About how I dismissed your career choice because it didn't match my narrow definition of value. And I should acknowledge how defensive I became, Emma added. How I measured my success partly by how thoroughly I could prove you wrong. They developed a presentation that alternated between their perspectives, revealing both the pain of their earlier disconnect and the process of their reconciliation. They included hospital colleagues who had witnessed the transformation, data that demonstrated the impact of their integrated approach, and candid reflections on what they had learned from each other. The weekend before the conference, Emma traveled to Lakeside for final preparations. She arrived at her parents' home to find her father in his study, surrounded by family photographs he had pulled from albums and frames around the house. "What's all this?" she asked, surveying the collection spread across his desk. "Visual aids for our presentation," he explained. "If we're going to tell the story, we should show it too." Emma picked up a photo she hadn't seen in years, herself, at her business school graduation, standing slightly apart from her family, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I remember this day. You asked me 3 times if I was sure I didn't want to apply to medical school before it's too late." And her father winced. "I was relentless, wasn't I?" "You were being a father as you understood it," Emma replied, the old hurt long since faded. "Trying to guide me toward what you believed was the best path. Based on my limited understanding of what best meant." He picked up another photograph, this one from the Lakeside Memorial funding announcement, capturing the moment he had publicly acknowledged Emma's expertise. "It took me far too long to see what was right in front of me." Emma sat across from him, studying the visual timeline he had assembled. "We could organize these chronologically, she suggested. Show the evolution from tension to collaboration. And end with this, Richard said, revealing a professional portrait taken for the Wright website. Father and daughter standing side by side, equal partners in the enterprise they had built together. As they arranged the photographs, Richard paused, holding a family picture from Emma's childhood, a holiday gathering where she sat cross-legged on the floor, intently studying a book about the stock market while the rest of the family watched a football game. The signs were always there, he said quietly. Your natural affinity for financial concepts, your systems thinking. I just couldn't see it because it didn't fit my preconception of what you should become. We often see what we expect to see, Emma replied. It's human nature. Perhaps, but that doesn't excuse it. He set the photograph aside with care. I've been thinking about our presentation, about the message we want to convey. Beyond the healthcare integration model? He nodded. I want other parents, other fathers especially, to hear this story and question their assumptions about their children's paths. To consider that their children might see possibilities they cannot yet imagine. The Madison Healthcare Leadership Conference was larger than they had anticipated. Over 800 attendees from across the medical and healthcare administration spectrum. Emma and Richard found themselves scheduled as keynote speakers on the second day, their session titled Beyond Boundaries, The Personal and Professional Journey of Wright. As they waited backstage, Emma noticed her father adjusting his tie repeatedly, a nervous habit she had rarely seen during his surgical career. Facing 800 healthcare executives more intimidating than performing open-heart surgery? She asked lightly. He smiled ruefully. Surgery, I know. Public vulnerability is somewhat new territory. We've rehearsed this thoroughly, Emma assured him. And we're telling our truth. That's all we need to do. The introduction concluded, and they walked onto the stage together. The lighting made it difficult to see individual faces in the audience, but Emma could sense the focused attention as they began their presentation. Richard spoke first. Most of you know me as Dr. Wright, cardiothoracic surgeon, former chief of surgery at Lakeside Memorial. Some of you may know my daughter Emma Wright, senior vice president at Meridian Capital and co-founder of our healthcare advisory practice. What most of you don't know is the story of how a heart attack and a hospital funding application transformed not just our professional lives, but our fundamental understanding of what matters in healthcare and in family. For the next hour, they alternated speaking, their rehearsed narrative flowing naturally as they shared their journey from misunderstanding to collaboration. They showed the photographs, described key moments of realization, and explained how their painful disconnection had ultimately led to a powerful new approach to healthcare challenges. I had always believed that saving lives was the highest calling, Richard explained, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. I measured all other professions against that standard and found them wanting, including my daughter's chosen field of finance. Emma picked up the thread, and I had internalized that judgment, constantly trying to prove that my work mattered too, that moving money could be as valuable as wielding a scalpel. We were both wrong, Richard continued. Not because either perspective lacked value, but because we failed to see how they complement each other. How patient care ultimately depends on sustainable systems, and how financial models mean nothing if they don't serve human needs. As they moved through their story, Emma noticed a shift in the audience. Heads nodding in recognition, notes being taken, occasional murmurs of agreement. Their personal journey was resonating with these professionals who often found themselves on opposite sides of healthcare debates. They concluded with the impact their integrated approach had achieved: improved patient outcomes, more sustainable funding models, innovative delivery systems that reached underserved populations. The financial data and clinical metrics served as evidence that bridging professional divides created tangible benefits. Emma delivered the final thought. The story of Wright is ultimately about seeing beyond our professional identities. to recognize the value in perspectives different from our own. It's about understanding that the most innovative solutions often emerge from the tension between seemingly opposing viewpoints, not when one dominates the other, but when both are heard and respected. The applause that followed was sustained and enthusiastic. As it subsided, the moderator opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up across the auditorium. A hospital CEO was the first to speak. Your story is compelling, but how do you translate this personal reconciliation into institutional change? Most hospitals are structured to keep clinical and financial decisions separate. That's precisely the problem, Richard replied. The separation creates artificial barriers. We've found that creating integrated decision-making teams, where clinical and financial experts work together from the beginning of a project, rather than in sequence, produces better outcomes for both patients and institutions. Emma added, "It requires cultural change, not just structural adjustment. People need to value the expertise they don't personally possess." More questions followed, about specific methodologies, metrics for success, strategies for overcoming institutional resistance. Emma and Richard answered each one, sometimes deferring to each other's expertise, sometimes building on the other's response to create a more comprehensive answer. The final question came from a young woman in the back row. "This is more personal," she began tentatively. "I'm a medical resident who's also pursuing an MBA. My attending physicians often question my commitment to medicine because of this dual focus. Do you have advice for those of us trying to bridge these worlds from the beginning of our careers?" Emma and Richard exchanged a glance, both recognizing the parallel to Sophia's situation and to what might have been Emma's path under different circumstances. Richard leaned toward the microphone. "Find mentors who recognize the value of your integrated perspective, even if they don't share it themselves. And know that what some may see as divided focus is actually a unique strength. Healthcare needs more bridge builders, not fewer. And remember," Emma added, "that your value isn't defined by how well you conform to traditional expectations. It's defined by the unique contribution only you can make." After the presentation concluded, they were surrounded by attendees eager to continue the conversation. Hospital administrators described their struggles to align clinical and financial priorities. Physicians confessed their frustration with budgetary constraints they didn't fully understand. Financial officers admitted their difficulty translating spreadsheet decisions into patient care implications. A gray-haired physician approached Richard, hand extended. "We were residents together at Johns Hopkins," he said. "I never imagined seeing you champion a perspective like this. It's refreshing. Life has a way of expanding our vision if we let it," Richard replied, clasping his colleague's hand warmly. Later, as they gathered their materials, the conference organizer approached with evident satisfaction. "That was exactly what we hoped for," she said. "Personal, substantive, and challenging to our traditional silos. Would you consider developing this into a workshop for our Leadership Institute?" Emma looked to her father, who nodded his agreement. "We'd be delighted to explore that possibility," she replied. That evening, at dinner in the hotel restaurant, they reviewed the day's events, still energized by the response their presentation had received. "Do you realize," Richard said, setting down his water glass, "that this is precisely what I once dismissed as just talking about money? The work we're doing now, consulting, presenting, advising, it's having more widespread impact than my surgical practice ever could, reaching thousands of patients I'll never meet through improved systems. Different tools, same mission," Emma observed. "Healing and helping, just at a different scale." He nodded thoughtfully. "When I called you a disappointment that night at dinner, I couldn't see beyond my own narrow definition of contribution. I couldn't imagine that your path might lead to something that would transform not just your life, but mine as well." Emma reached across the table to take his hand. That dinner feels like it happened in another lifetime. In many ways, it did. He squeezed her hand gently. I was a different person then. We both were. Their conversation was interrupted by a notification on Emma's phone, an email from Sophia Martinez with the subject line, "Amazing news." Emma scanned the message quickly, then looked up with a bright smile. Sophia's medical school project on integrated clinical financial decision-making has been accepted for publication in the Journal of Medical Economics. She's acknowledging Wright as her inspiration. Richard's face lit up with genuine pleasure. The next generation already building on our foundation. That's a legacy worth celebrating. As they finished their meal, Emma found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The father who had once dismissed her career as inferior to medicine now valued their collaboration as his most significant professional contribution. The dynamic that had once been defined by judgment and disappointment had transformed into mutual respect and appreciation. "What are you thinking?" her father asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About how completely things can change," she replied. "About how the worst moments sometimes lead to the best outcomes." He nodded, understanding her reference to that painful dinner and all that had followed. "If I hadn't called you a disappointment, if you hadn't overheard that hospital funding application call, if I hadn't had a heart attack, we might never have discovered what we could create together." "I wouldn't recommend your method," Emma said with a gentle smile, "but I can't argue with the results." The next morning, as they prepared to return to Lakeside, Emma received a call from Marcus at her New York office. "Emma, the board is requesting your presence at next week's strategic planning session. They're particularly interested in the healthcare integration model you've been developing with your father." Wright is on Meridian's radar?" she asked, surprised. "More than on the radar," Marcus replied. "They're considering establishing a dedicated division for integrated healthcare investment using your approach as the foundation. They want you to lead it." Emma thanked him and promised to attend, her mind already racing with possibilities. When she shared the news with her father as they waited for their flight, his eyes widened. "A whole division based on our approach? That's remarkable, Emma." "It's preliminary," she cautioned. "Just a discussion at this point. But significant nonetheless." He studied her face. "How do you feel about it?" Emma considered the question carefully. "Validated, certainly, but also protective of what we've built together. If Meridian wants to adopt our approach, I'd want to ensure they understand the importance of the clinical financial partnership, not just the metrics." Richard nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "A year ago, you might have seen this primarily as professional vindication. Proof to me and everyone else that your path was valuable. And now? Now you're thinking about the integrity of the work itself, the impact rather than the recognition." Emma realized he was right. Her relationship with success had shifted as her need for external validation, particularly her father's, had diminished. What mattered now was the work itself, the difference they were making together. Their flight was called, and as they gathered their belongings, Richard placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Whatever you decide about Meridian's proposal, know that I'm proud of you, not because of your title or the recognition you've received, but because of the leader and innovator you've become." Emma felt the familiar warmth of her father's approval, once so desperately sought, now deeply appreciated, but no longer essential to her sense of worth. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot, coming from you." As they boarded the plane that would carry them back to Lakeside, Emma thought about the complex journey that had brought them to this point. The painful words spoken across a dinner table, "You'll always be the disappointment," had initiated a chain of events that ultimately transformed not just their relationship, but their professional lives and the healthcare landscape they both served. Those words, once so wounding, had lost their power. They remained part of their shared history, a catalyst for change rather than a defining judgment. In their place had grown something neither could have imagined, a partnership of equals, a bridge between worlds, and a legacy more meaningful than either could have created alone. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Emma glanced at her father, who had already opened his laptop to review notes for their next client meeting. Dr. Richard Wright, once defined solely by his surgical precision, now equally committed to building systems that extended care beyond what his hands alone could provide. The father, who had once seen only one path to significance, now championed the value of diverse perspectives. And she, Emma Wright, once desperate to prove her worth against an impossible standard, now secure in the knowledge that her unique vision had created something truly valuable, not despite taking a different path than her father had planned, but because of it. The disappointment had become the catalyst, the division had become the bridge, and in that transformation lay not just their personal reconciliation, but a model for healthcare that honored both the science of healing and the systems that made it possible, proving that sometimes the most powerful innovations emerge not from within established boundaries, but from the courage to transcend them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.